Every Native American, from Alaska to Patagonia, traces back to one region on the far side of the planet, southern Siberia, roughly 12,000 miles away. Most people would guess East Asia. The clearest genetic thread actually runs to a single child, buried in the Siberian cold 24,000 years ago, in a place called Malta. That child's people were not the only ancestors of Native Americans, but their DNA is the missing half of a story the textbooks skipped. Hidden in that one genome was a signal that looked impossible for the Americas, a thread that pointed west toward Ice Age Europe. For a long time, the map showed one simple arrow from Asia into Alaska and nothing more. The full picture is much older and much messier. It starts with 5 genetic markers in the blood, and one of them points to the wrong side of the world. Start with the markers, because they are where this whole mystery began. Long before anyone could sequence a full genome, scientists could read one small, sturdy piece of DNA that is passed down almost unchanged from a mother to her children. It is called mitochondrial DNA, and it traces a single, unbroken line back through your mother, her mother, and so on for thousands of years. It sorts people into broad family branches called haplogroups. When researchers looked at indigenous populations across both American continents, almost everyone fell into just 5 of these maternal branches. They named them A, B, C, and D, along with a rare 5th one called X. 4 of those 5 were the easy part. Haplogroups A, B, C, and D are common across Eastern Asia and Siberia, exactly where you would expect if the first Americans walked in from that direction. The founding versions found in the Americas, the ones geneticists label A2, B2, C1, and D1, look like a clean sample carried over from the north. That fit the textbook story perfectly. Then there was X. The American branch, called X2A, did not play along. It appeared in a scattering of northern Native American groups, and then it turned up again thousands of miles away, in the Near East and parts of Europe. What it mostly did not do was appear in Eastern Asia, along the very route everyone assumed the first Americans had taken. For years, that one marker sat there like a fingerprint at a crime scene that matched the wrong suspect. It quietly suggested that the story of who reached the Americas and where they came from was missing a piece. To see why X was such a problem, you have to understand the story it seemed to break. For most of the last century, the answer to Native American origins felt settled. During the last ice age, so much of the world's water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels fell by hundreds of feet. Where the Bering Strait sits today, between Siberia and Alaska, the exposed seabed rose into dry land. This was Beringia, a cold grassland bridge wide enough to be its own country. The standard picture said small bands of hunters followed the animals across it, slipped south through a gap in the ice, and over thousands of years became every indigenous nation from the Arctic to the tip of South America. There was even a name for the tidy version, the Clovis first model, built around the famous stone spear points found across North America. One source, one direction, one clean arrow on the map. It is a good story, and the bones and the tools mostly backed it up. The trouble is that bones and tools tell you where people were and roughly when they were there. They cannot tell you exactly who those people were related to. For that, you need the genome itself. And when scientists finally pulled a full ancient genome out of the ground, the clean arrow began to bend. The deepest answer to where these travelers came from was not waiting in East Asia. It was waiting in a small rise of earth beside a river in southern Siberia. In the 1920s, Soviet archaeologists digging near the village of Malta, close to Lake Baikal, uncovered the burial of a young boy. He had died around 24,000 years ago, deep in the Ice Age, laid to rest among grave goods that included ivory beads and carved figurines. For decades, he was just another ancient skeleton in a museum collection. Then, in 2014, a team led by Eska Willerslev and Manasa Rahavan sequenced his DNA, and the answer overturned the textbook. The Malta boy belonged to a population geneticists now call the Ancient North Eurasians, a kind of ghost lineage that once stretched across the top of the Ice Age world. His people were not East Asians. Their genetic signature leaned partly toward the West, toward the same deep roots that later fed into Ice Age Europeans. And a large slice of that exact signature was sitting inside living Native Americans. Depending on the group, somewhere between roughly 14 and 38% of Native American ancestry traces back to this ancient North Eurasian line. There, at last, was the lead on that puzzling Western signal. The European-leaning thread in Native American DNA had not arrived by some lost voyage across the Atlantic. It was already present in Siberia 24,000 years ago, carried by the people the Malta boy belonged to. Exactly how the X marker itself made the crossing is still debated, but the deep link to that Western Ice Age ancestry had stopped being a mystery. If a single buried child rewriting the map of two continents is the kind of thing you want more of, take 1 second to subscribe, because it only gets deeper from here. The Malta people are only half of the answer. The other half of the ancestry came from the East. Whole genome studies show that Native Americans descend from two ancient sources, not just the Malta-related line. At some point before anyone set foot in the Americas, that northern line mixed with a population closely related to the peoples of Eastern Asia. The result was a fused ancestry that exists in that exact combination nowhere else on Earth. And that fusion had time to settle because the travelers did not cross Beringia in one quick dash. The evidence points to a long pause, an idea called the Beringian standstill. For thousands of years during the coldest stretch of the Ice Age, this population sat isolated in the Beringian region, boxed in by ice ahead of them and harsh ground behind, slowly becoming distinct from everyone they had left in Asia. Estimates for how long they waited range from a few thousand years to many more, and that debate is still open. When the ice finally loosened its grip, around 16,000 years ago, they moved south quickly, likely down the open Pacific coast as much as through any inland corridor. You can see the proof in the ground. A Clovis-era infant from Montana, known as Anzic-1 and sequenced by Morten Rasmussen's team in 2014, turned out to be directly ancestral to a huge share of living Native Americans, especially across Central and South America. That single genome tied the ancient Clovis toolmakers, the people who left those famous spear points, directly to the living descendants of the first Americans, closing a gap that stone tools alone never could. It also hinted that the northern and southern branches of Native American ancestry had begun to split apart early on, something later studies would map out in far more detail. The blend, the long pause, and the sprint south all leave their fingerprints in the same DNA you can sample today. Here's the honest version of the answer the thumbnail promised. If you want to know which living people on Earth are the closest relatives of Native Americans, the trail points to southern Siberia, toward the Altai region and the lands around Lake Baikal. People who take ancestry tests notice it constantly, matches turning up in Kazakhstan, in Yakutia, among the peoples of the Altai. There are cultural echoes too, from shared nomadic traditions to a deep and ancient respect for the land and the open sky. The viral videos quietly skip the next part, though. No living group is a direct ancestor. The population that actually gave rise to the first Americans is gone. The closest match ever found is not a modern tribe at all, but an extinct group geneticists call the Ancient Paleo-Siberians, identified from remains near the Kolyma River in far northeastern Siberia, and studied by Martin Sikora's team in 2019. Living Siberians such as the Altaians share a great deal of ancestry with that vanished population, which is why the DNA keeps pointing their way. Those living groups are cousins, not parents, Native Americans still carry the majority of their ancestry from that Eastern, East Asian-related source. This is also why a consumer ancestry test can be so confusing on this exact point. Those tests compare you against panels of people living today, and there is no living ancient Paleo-Siberian to compare against, so the deep signal gets split up and labeled as bits of Siberian, East Asian, or simply Indigenous American. The homeland does not show up as a tidy dot on the map, because the population that was the homeland is no longer walking around to be sampled. The honest answer is bigger than any single modern village. The source was a specific Ice Age population in a cold corner of Siberia that no longer exists in pure form anywhere on Earth. That answer is harder to fit on a thumbnail, and it is far more interesting than the clickbait version. Now for the part that breaks the neat timeline. The whole land bridge story depends on when people could actually move. The ice-free corridor into the heart of the Americas is usually dated to around 16,000 years ago, with the coastal route opening a little earlier. But at White Sands in New Mexico, researchers found human footprints pressed into the mud of an ancient lakeshore. When Matthew Bennett's team first dated them in 2021, the footprints came back at roughly 21 to 23,000 years old, and a follow-up study using completely independent methods later confirmed that astonishing age. That is thousands of years before the inland corridor was supposed to be open, earlier even than the coastal route is thought to have cleared, and well before the standstill population was thought to have poured south. Both things somehow appear to be true at once. The genetics point to a main migration after the ice pulled back, and yet the footprints show that someone was already walking the shores of the American Southwest much, much earlier. This is part of why the old Clovis first model quietly collapsed. If the inland corridor was still sealed by ice, the earliest arrivals could not have marched down the middle of the continent, which pushed researchers toward a different route entirely, a coastal one, hopping down the Pacific edge by boat and on foot while the interior was still frozen. That coastal path is hard to prove because the shorelines those people would have used are now underwater, drowned when the glaciers melted and the seas rose again. Researchers are still arguing about how to fit the footprints and the genomes together, whether there was an earlier wave that mostly vanished, whether that wave left any descendants at all, or whether the dates themselves will shift again with better methods. That leaves one question worth arguing over in the comments. If people were already in New Mexico 21,000 years ago, who were they? And does the DNA of living Native Americans carry any trace of them at all? Drop your best theory below, because this is exactly where the experts themselves still disagree. And the footprints are not the only loose thread. When David Reich and Pontus Skoglund's team looked closely at Amazonian groups such as the Surui and the Caritiana in 2015, they found something they nicknamed Population Y from Ipaiquera, a word meaning ancestor. Buried in the DNA of these South American peoples was a faint signal that did not line up with Siberia and did not line up with East Asia either. It leaned toward Australasians, the deep shared ancestry of indigenous Australians, Papuans, and the people of the Andaman Islands. Nobody has fully explained how a whisper of Australasian ancestry ended up deep in the Amazon and almost nowhere else in the Americas. The strangest part is where it does and does not appear. It shows up in certain Amazonian groups, yet it is largely missing from the peoples of Central America and the far north, which is the opposite of what you would expect if it had simply washed in with the main migration. The leading idea is that it rode in with a now vanished founding population that crossed Beringia very early, pushed all the way to South America, and left only a faint trace behind before being mostly absorbed or replaced. Some researchers are more cautious and think the signal will shrink as more ancient genomes are read. Either way, it is a genuine loose end that the tidy single migration story simply cannot hold. On top of that, the Nadeni-speaking peoples of the far north, examined in Reich's 2012 study, show signs of a separate later pulse of gene flow out of Asia, distinct from the first Americans. A reminder that the door between the continents did not slam shut after the first crossing. So the neat single arrow keeps splintering into something messier. One main migration, yes, but with earlier footprints that do not fit. A ghost signal from the far side of the Pacific, and at least one later wave layered on top of it all. Pull every thread together, and the shape of the answer changes completely. Native American origins look less like a single line drawn from one Asian village to Alaska, and more like a sprawling web. This is a fused people, born from an Ice Age meeting between the Maleta-related North and an East Asian-related East, who paused for thousands of years in a drowned land called Beringia, then spread south and became hundreds of distinct nations. Their deepest homeland was a specific Siberian population that no longer exists. Their closest living cousins sit today in the Altai and around Lake Baikal, and their full story still carries loose threads that geneticists have not tied off. It is worth being honest about what DNA can and cannot do here. It can trace deep ancestry and ancient migrations with confidence. It cannot capture the languages, the nations, or the identities that people built once they arrived. What it does say, it says clearly. When Kennewick Man, a skeleton roughly 9,000 years old from Washington State, was finally sequenced by Rasmussen's team in 2015, he came back most closely related to living Native Americans, quietly confirming that the people who were here early are the direct kin of the people who are here now. That much the science is sure of, and it is worth saying plainly, because so much of what circulates online gets it wrong. If this untangled the story for you, share it with the one person you know who still thinks it was just a simple walk across a bridge. The bridge was real. It was only the smallest part of a far older journey.